In 1958, a Chinese pilot climbed into a fighter jet that was, essentially, a Soviet blueprint copied by hand, riveted together in a factory that had only just learned how to build a jet engine at all. 66 years later, in the same skies over Chengdu, a three-engine stealth prototype with no tail lifted off before the United States had even flown its own answer to it. In between those two moments lies one of the strangest stories in modern military history. Not a story of sudden genius, but of patience, copying, buying, failing, and quietly rebuilding, generation after generation, until the copies became originals and the originals started setting the pace. This is the story of how China closed a 70-year gap in air power in roughly 20 years, told through the machines that made it possible, from a Cold War relic that could barely turn without stalling, to a jet so radical that Western analysts still cannot agree on what to call it. 25 aircraft, 6 chapters, one relentless climb, and by every indication available right now, it is still going. Chapter 1: Ghosts of the Cold War, China's First Borrowed Wings. The Shenyang J-6 was never meant to be original. It was a direct copy of the Soviet MiG-19, and China began producing it in 1958 after Moscow shared the blueprints during the brief window of Sino-Soviet cooperation, before the relationship soured completely. Over 3,000 were eventually built, making it one of the most mass-produced fighters in Chinese aviation history. And for 2 decades, it was, quite simply, the backbone of the entire Air Force. It was genuinely fast for its era, supersonic in level flight, but it carried almost no radar worth mentioning, and depended entirely on pure, visual dogfighting, the pilot's eyes doing the work a modern sensor would do today. Maintenance crews reportedly kept early batches flying with tools and spare parts, improvised locally, because the formal supply chain from Moscow dried up almost as soon as it opened. Decades after its retirement from frontline duty, surplus J-6 airframes found a strange second career, converted into target drones and, in some documented cases, even improvised unmanned strike aircraft. A Cold War fighter still finding new ways to be useful long after its original purpose expired. Then came the J-7, and this one simply refused to die. Based on the Soviet MiG-21, Chengdu began licensed production in the 1960s, and the type stayed in frontline PLAAF service for more than 4 decades, an almost unheard-of production run for a single airframe. It was continuously reworked along the way. New radars bolted in, new missiles hung under the wings, new cockpit displays crammed into a fuselage conceived under a completely different doctrine. Export versions reached dozens of air forces around the world, and some J-7 variants were still flying operational patrols well into the 2010s, a fighter that by any reasonable measure should have become a museum piece decades earlier. It proved something important early on, that China could take a foreign design and keep stretching its useful life almost indefinitely through constant incremental upgrades rather than expensive wholesale replacement. The J-8 was different, and this one mattered for a reason that has nothing to do with its top speed. It was China's first fully domestic fighter design, a tall, needle-nosed interceptor built for altitude and raw speed rather than agility, entering service in 1980. But it was, in a very real sense, half-finished. Its radar was primitive, its avionics were dated on arrival, and Beijing knew it better than anyone. In the 1980s, China actually partnered with the United States on a program called Peace Pearl, intended to fit American radar and avionics into upgraded J-8 airframes, a level of cooperation almost unthinkable by today's standards. The plan collapsed after 1989. When sanctions following Tiananmen Square froze the cooperation for good, and China was left to solve its avionics gap entirely on its own, a setback that quietly shaped the next 20 years of decision-making. Later J-8 variants did eventually receive improved radar and a limited beyond visual range missile capability, but by then the design was already approaching obsolescence against the fighters other nations were fielding. Chapter 2. Borrowed Wings. China's Shortcut Through Russian Steel. By the early 1990s, China's fighter force was still stuck roughly a generation behind its neighbors and rivals, and Beijing decided the fastest way to catch up was simply to buy the answer outright. In 1992, China purchased its first batch of Sukhoi Su-27 flankers from Russia, in a deal reportedly worth around $1 billion. For the PLAAF, it was transformative overnight. The first fighter in the fleet with genuine beyond-visual range missiles, a real pulse Doppler radar, and modern fly-by-wire flight controls. It was also, quietly, a template. Chinese engineers picked the airframe apart piece by piece to learn everything they possibly could from it, down to the composition of the composite panels and the wiring behind the cockpit displays. Moscow reportedly had reservations about how far that reverse engineering would eventually go, reservations that would resurface years later when licensing disputes started souring the relationship. Out of that same period came the Chengdu J-10, China's first genuinely indigenous fourth-generation fighter. It first flew in 1998 and entered service in 2005, built around a distinctive canard delta layout and, in its early years, a Russian AL-31FN engine, simply because China's own turbofan technology was not yet mature enough to be trusted. Persistent rumors have long linked elements of its aerodynamic design to Israel's cancelled Lavi fighter program from the 1980s, though Beijing has never officially confirmed the connection. Whatever its true origins, the J-10 went on to become the backbone of China's homegrown fighter industry for the next 2 decades, spawning multiple upgraded variants with progressively better radar and weapons, and it remains in frontline service today, still receiving new avionics packages more than 25 years after its first flight. The Shenyang J-11 started life humbly, as little more than a licensed assembly line for the Su-27SK, bolting together kits shipped directly from Russia with minimal local input. But piece by piece, year by year, China began swapping in domestic radar, domestic avionics, and eventually domestic structural components, quietly building the industrial base that would make full indigenous production possible. Few people remember how genuinely unglamorous that process actually was, years of unremarkable factory work that nobody photographed for an airshow. It was, in effect, the quiet apprenticeship that made every later flanker derivative in Chinese service possible, from strike jets to electronic warfare platforms built decades afterward. Meanwhile, the Xi'an JH-7, nicknamed the Flying Leopard, gave the Navy something it had desperately lacked: a dedicated fighter bomber built for maritime strike. Entering service in 1998 with real anti-ship missile capability and engines derived from a licensed Rolls-Royce Spey design acquired decades earlier. It was not elegant, and pilots reportedly found it demanding to fly at low speed, unforgiving of small mistakes on approach. Still, it was the first Chinese aircraft that let naval aviation credibly threaten enemy ships far from the coastline rather than simply defending the shore. China went back to Russia for still more firepower, ordering the Su-30MKK starting in 1999. Around 76 of the type were eventually delivered, a heavier, strike-capable flanker variant purpose-built to Chinese specifications, followed shortly afterward by the navalized Su-30MK2, tuned specifically for anti-ship missions with the KH-31 missile. These were stopgap purchases in every sense, expensive and diplomatically awkward given the underlying tension over intellectual property, but they bought China's domestic industry precious years to mature without leaving any capability gap exposed in the meantime. And then, almost as a footnote at the time, came the JF-17 Thunder, first flown in 2003, co-developed together with Pakistan and built partly around the same engine lineage that also powered the MiG-29. It was China's first real export success in modern fighter technology, a lightweight, affordable multi-role jet that would eventually fly in the colors of several air forces across Asia and Africa. It proved, for the first time, that China could sell fighters to the world, not just buy them from it, and the program's low unit cost made it especially attractive to air forces that could never afford a Western equivalent. Chapter 3. Mastering the Flanker, From License Copy to Homegrown Engine. By 2007, the J-11B appeared. And this is where the story quietly turns on itself. Gone were the Russian engines and Russian avionics of the original licensed jets. In their place sat Chinese radar, Chinese mission systems, and, critically, the indigenous WS-10A Taihang turbofan. It did not go smoothly at first. Early WS-10 engines suffered persistent reliability problems, occasional in-flight failures, and a production process that lagged years behind its original schedule. Some units reportedly needed engine changes far more often than their Russian-powered predecessors, a frustrating trade-off for a program meant to prove independence. But it represented China's first serious, sustained attempt at true engine self-sufficiency, and that mattered far more in the long run than any single published specification. The J-15, nicknamed Flying Shark, has an unusually tangled origin story. It traces back to an unfinished Su-33 prototype airframe acquired from Ukraine in the early 2000s, reverse-engineered piece by piece and adapted for Chinese carrier operations from the ground up. In November 2012, a J-15 made China's first-ever arrested landing aboard the carrier Liaoning, a single moment captured on state television and replayed for years afterward, that turned the PLA Navy from a purely coastal force into something with genuine, if still limited, blue water ambitions. Early versions relied on a ski jump launch rather than catapults, which meaningfully limited how much fuel and ordnance the jet could carry off the deck. China went shopping in Moscow one more time. On the 26th of November 2015, Beijing confirmed a deal for 24 Su-35 fighters, making China the very first export customer for the type anywhere in the world, ahead of every other Russian client. The appeal was specific and well understood on both sides. The AL-41F-1S engines allowed supercruise without afterburner, and the Irbis E radar could reportedly track targets at genuinely extreme range. China wanted the underlying technology at least as much as the finished aircraft itself, and Russian officials were reportedly wary enough of that appetite that they initially resisted selling anything less than a full squadron-sized batch, hoping to limit how thoroughly the design could be studied and copied. The J-16 arrived around the same period, a two-seat, long-range, multi-role strike variant built directly on the flanker airframe. Entering service around 2015 with a domestic AESA radar and a weapons payload broadly comparable to the American F-15E Strike Eagle, it became the true workhorse of China's heavy strike fleet, far less glamorous than the stealth programs running in parallel, but produced in much greater numbers, flown far more often, and capable of carrying a genuinely large mix of anti-ship, anti-radar, and precision-guided munitions on a single sortie. This one gets overlooked constantly, and it probably shouldn't be. The J-16D, revealed around 2018, is a dedicated electronic warfare variant, stripped of its internal cannon and loaded instead with jamming pods slung along its wingtips and fuselage. It exists purely to blind enemy radar and scramble enemy communications before other aircraft ever arrive on target. A rough Chinese counterpart to the American EA-18G Growler, and one of the clearest signs that PLAAF doctrine had matured well beyond simply putting more missiles into the sky. Chapter 4. Into the Shadows, China Enters the Stealth Age. On the 11th of January 2011, the Chengdu J-20 made its first flight, and the timing genuinely stunned almost everyone watching from outside China. Western intelligence assessments had generally placed a credible Chinese stealth fighter a decade further out than this. Here, it was already airborne, angular, canarded, unmistakably built around low observability from the very first sketch, with a fuselage length exceeding 20 meters and internal weapons bays large enough to carry long-range air-to-air missiles without spoiling its radar signature. Its early production engines, however, told a much quieter and more honest story. The first J-20s flew with Russian AL-31FM-2 engines purely as a stopgap, because China's airframe design had leapt years ahead of its ability to build a matching indigenous power plant. Barely 18 months later, on the 31st of October 2012, a second, very different stealth aircraft appeared out of Shenyang. The FC-31, sometimes referred to as the J-31, was a privately funded twin-engine demonstrator, noticeably smaller than the J-20 and originally built without any guaranteed military customer at all. Its existence made China only the second nation on Earth flying two entirely separate stealth fighter designs at the same time. Few people remember that it started life as a private gamble rather than a state program. The J-20 formally entered operational service in March 2017, making China only the second country in the world, after the United States, to field a genuinely operational stealth fighter. It was a real watershed moment for the entire region, even while the underlying engine issue lingered unresolved in the background for years afterward. China was not only building stealth fighters, it was quietly building stealth drones too. The GJ-11 Sharpsword, a flying-wing unmanned combat aircraft, was first revealed around 2013 through leaked factory images and then shown publicly at the Zhuhai Air Show in 2019. With no tail, no vertical surfaces, and a shape clearly optimized against radar detection, it gave China a credible unmanned stealth strike option years before most of its rivals had anything comparable actually flying. Its internal weapons bay and jet black radar absorbent coating drew immediate, if inevitable, comparisons to America's own experimental flying wing drones, though the two programs developed on completely separate tracks. Around 2021, the J-20A variant finally addressed the lingering engine problem, integrating the indigenous WS-10C turbofan and enabling true supercruise without relying on any Russian hardware whatsoever. It was not the final answer, that would come later, but it closed the single most embarrassing gap in an otherwise formidable aircraft, and production reportedly surged in the years that followed, as confidence in the new engine grew across the fleet. None of this stealth ambition would have mattered without reach, and that is precisely where the Xi'an Y-20 came in. First flown in January 2013 and entering service in July 2016, it was China's first true strategic heavy transport, finally giving the PLAAF the ability to move troops, heavy equipment, and eventually fuel across the vast distances its growing ambitions actually required. Without it, almost everything that came afterward would have stayed confined close to the coastline. Its four domestically produced turbofan engines replaced an earlier reliance on Russian power plants, and the airframe's boxy, high-winged silhouette quickly became a familiar sight at military parades, a visible symbol of a logistics capability China had simply never possessed before. Rounding out this phase, the J-15D appeared around 2021, an electronic warfare version of the carrier-based Flying Shark, extending China's carrier air wing into contested, jammed environments the exact same way the J-16D had already done for land-based operations. Its arrival meant even the fleet at sea now had its own dedicated blind spot hunter, a jet whose wingtip pods do far more damage to an enemy's situational awareness than to any physical target below. Chapter 5. The New Guard, Stealth Fighters Ready for a Carrier Deck. This one was different, because it quietly solved a problem the Americans never actually bothered to solve. The J-20S, revealed in 2021, is a twin-seat variant of the stealth fighter, a configuration the F-22 never received in its entire production run. The second seat allows one crew member to manage sensor fusion, drone teaming, and complex mission commanding while the pilot flies the aircraft, effectively turning the J-20S into a flying command post for a future generation of unmanned wingmen. It was later spotted operating as a chase plane during some of China's most sensitive early sixth-generation test flights, an oddly fitting second job for a jet built around commanding other aircraft. Starting in late 2024, production J-20S finally began receiving the long-awaited WS-15 engine, reportedly delivering around 19 tons of afterburning thrust, more than the F-119 engine that currently powers the American F-22. After more than a decade of stopgap Russian power plants and quiet institutional frustration, China's flagship stealth fighter finally had an engine that matched its airframe's ambition on paper, reportedly built around advanced single-crystal turbine blades capable of withstanding far higher operating temperatures than the engines they replaced. The Shenyang J-35 grew directly out of that FC-31 demonstrator from a decade earlier, formally introduced on the 3rd of September 2025 as a dedicated carrier-capable stealth fighter. It gives China a rough, functional answer to the American F-35, and unlike the land-based J-20, it was designed from the outset for catapult launches and arrested landings out at sea, a very different set of structural and aerodynamic demands that meant reinforced landing gear, folding wingtips, and a beefed-up airframe compared to its export-oriented ancestor. And extending all of it outward is the Xi'an YY-20, an aerial refueling tanker built on the existing Y-20 transport airframe, which entered service in the early 2020s. Without tankers, stealth fighters remain essentially coastal defenders. With them, they become instruments capable of reaching far beyond China's own shoreline, which was always the entire point of building them in the first place. This one rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as the fighters it supports, yet without it, none of their range figures on paper mean very much in practice. Chapter 6. Beyond the Fifth Generation, the Race Nobody Saw Coming. On the 26th of December, 2024, cameras over Chengdu caught something nobody in the West was fully prepared for: a massive, tailless, three-engine aircraft escorted by a twin-seat J-20S, flying as its chase plane. There was no official announcement, no state media rollout, just grainy amateur footage circulating within hours, and analysts scrambling to make sense of it. They quickly designated it the J-36. It is enormous by fighter standards, with an estimated maximum takeoff weight north of 50 tons, a diamond-shaped flying wing planform, and 3 separate internal weapons bays, a configuration built for both stealth and sheer payload volume at once. The trijet layout alone is almost unheard of in modern fighter design, apparently chosen to provide both raw thrust and a level of engine redundancy in a genuinely contested environment. Analysts have noted a side-by-side two-seat cockpit arrangement, each crew member with a dedicated display, unlike the tandem seating found in most twin-seat fighters, hinting at a command and control role built into the airframe from day one. This one arrived almost unnoticed by comparison, which somehow makes it more interesting. Just days earlier, on the 20th of December 2024, the Shenyang J-50 was spotted for the first time, a smaller, twin-engine tailless design, widely assessed as a future carrier-based platform and the natural successor to the entire J-35 lineage. Its more compact proportions and folding wingtip details fueled speculation almost immediately about a future role aboard China's next-generation carriers, a smaller stablemate to the much larger J-36 rather than a direct rival to it. Together, the J-36 and the J-50 meant China now had 2 completely separate sixth-generation fighter programs flying within the same month, an achievement no other country on Earth, including the United States, could yet claim. Through 2025, the pace only intensified rather than settling down. A third J-36 prototype appeared with its flight test pitot tube conspicuously removed, an unglamorous detail on the surface, but one that analysts read as a genuine signal, evidence the program had moved past its earliest, most cautious evaluation phase and into something closer to serious operational development. By the time America's own sixth-generation fighter, the F-47, was still years away from its first flight. China already had two rival tailless designs airborne, cutting hard turns and quietly refining their shapes in the open sky over Chengdu. 70 years ago, this story began with a hand-copied Soviet blueprint and a fighter that could barely track a target beyond visual range, let alone hit one. It arrives, for now, at a tailless, three-engine prototype that nobody in the West can even confidently classify yet. 25 aircraft, 5 generations, one uninterrupted climb from imitation to genuine ambition. Engines that once had to be borrowed are now built at home. Carriers that once had no aircraft to land on now have 3 variants competing for deck space. And a fighter force that once measured its ambitions by what it could copy now measures them by what nobody else has managed to fly yet. Whether the training, the maintenance culture, and the operational doctrine behind these machines can keep pace with the airframes themselves is a very different question entirely, and one that will quietly define whatever comes next.